Today, we will be talking about Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. The point of these notes today, of course, is to provide some background so we can better understand this complex text that we're about to read. So, if we're going to understand the text, we have to first understand who Prometheus was. Again, Mary Shelley subtitles her novel The Modern Prometheus. According to Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan. And he was best known for stealing fire from Mount Olympus and giving it to mankind. Prometheus always loved humans. He sympathized with them. He didn't treat them with the disrespect that the other gods did. And he, of course, wanted their betterment. And so he is famous, of course, for stealing the secret of fire, of how to create fire, and giving it to mankind. And in doing so, he enabled mankind to warm themselves. He enabled mankind to be able to prepare their food better. He just basically improved our lives. And the more important part about this is not necessarily about the fire; it is about bringing knowledge to mankind. The idea that we could use reason and intellect, and that we could determine for ourselves the betterment of our lives. And obviously, in doing so, Prometheus angers Zeus. And Zeus is so angry, in fact, that he enacts one of the most famous punishments in Greek mythology. He has Prometheus chained to a rock, and every day while he's chained to that rock, an eagle will appear and eat his liver. And over the course of the next 24 hours, his liver would slowly regrow, and the next day the eagle would return and continue this very painful process over and over every day for all eternity. It's one of the famous punishments exhibited by Zeus onto Prometheus for the fact that Prometheus stole fire and stole knowledge and gave it to mankind. And this, excuse me, this becomes an important motif in the text. The idea that in this story, light and fire will represent knowledge. So in those opening pages, in the opening paragraphs, when Robert Walton talks about, what may not be expected in a land of eternal light, that obviously has double meaning to it. That eternal light can be both going to the Arctic, going to a place where at certain times of the year the sun never sets, but it also represents the light representing science and knowledge in the land of discovery. So again, it is curious that Mary Shelley titles her novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, as if she is saying to us that Victor Frankenstein, our protagonist, is the modern Prometheus. And as we continue through our reading of the text, I would encourage you to start to ask yourself, why is it that Victor Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus? So let's talk a little bit about who this person was, the author, Mary Godwin. Mary Godwin is the daughter of two very famous writers, two very famous thinkers of the time. We're talking about the late 1700s, early 1800s here. Her father, William Godwin, was an English journalist. He was a radical philosopher. He sympathized with the French Revolution. Some would call him an anarchist. He was a famous political thinker of the time. He was off-traveled. Oftentimes he was visited by very famous dignitaries. He was well known in his time as being this radical philosopher. Then you have her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who, of course, we recognize as being one of the first feminists. She was a feminist writer who's famous for a famous essay titled The Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she advocated first-wave feminism for the social and moral equality of women, that women should be treated the same as men by the same moral standards. She was she was good friends with Abigail Adams, who was the wife of the second president of the United States. They had written a series of letters back and forth. And so she was a very, very famous writer in and of herself. The problem for Mary Shelley starts with the fact that when she is born, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, dies from complications of the childbirth. And so, Mary Shelley, number one, it's important to understand that she grows up as a young girl feeling a sense of guilt over the fact that she feels like she has killed her own mother. After the death of his wife, William Godwin, being, the very busy man that he is, really wanted to marry quickly, marry a second wife, so he had someone to raise his daughter. And so he does. He marries a woman by the name of Mary Claremont. Mary Claremont has her own children, including her daughter Claire, who's about Mary's age, and she brings them to live with them. And so it's not surprising then that Mary Godwin becomes a little disillusioned, as she doesn't like her stepmom, who obviously favors the other children. She's raised in this household. And so this does lead to that typical isolationism that exemplifies so many romantic writers. Think back to what we talked about with Samuel Taylor Coleridge or William Blake. So many of these incredible poets found themselves isolated. And that isolationism plays a huge role. When we talk about Victor or his creation feeling isolation in the text, that's what we're talking about. Mary Shelley felt that growing up. Combine that with the guilt of the fact that she feels like she killed her mother, and we can start to understand how a novel like this would come together. When she was 17, she falls in love with a young man by the name of Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Shelley is a bit older than her. Um, Percy Shelley was working with her father. He really respected Godwin's theories. They both were sympathizers with the French Revolution. They both had these radical ideas, and so he had spent a great deal of time actually working with her father on some of these theories. And so it's not surprising that Percy Shelley would have spent some time at Godwin's home, um, working with the father, and through that he meets young Mary Godwin. Um, so he meets her. They instantly fall in love, even though Percy Bysshe Shelley is married. He does have a wife. It doesn't matter to him. He falls in love with this young Mary Godwin. He actually she actually professed her love for him when they went on a date, and went a romantic date to go visit her mother's grave site. I mean, this is the type of woman we're talking about here. Um, but she does profess her love for him. They do decide to elope and run off together. And it's not hard to take a little Sigmund Freud here when you think about the Electra complex. Again, a reminder that the Electra complex suggests that every young woman symbolically seeks to murder her father and murder her mother and marry her father. Excuse me, to murder her mother and marry her father. Well, essentially, what has she done here? But through childbirth, she has actually murdered her mother, killed her mother, and then what does she look for then in a mate? But someone who would remind her of her father, someone like Percy Shelley, who was colleagues and friends with William Godwin. It's not that hard to understand that she would be drawn or attracted to someone who on a subconscious level, reminds her of her father. So they do elope in 1814. They run off. Percy leaves his pregnant wife. It creates scandals as for both families, and both of them are disowned by their families. And so all of a sudden, these two young people who grew up as part of these wealthy families, these famous families, all of a sudden find themselves married but alone, and isolated. So Timothy Shelley wanted nothing to do with Percy Shelley after this, and obviously Godwin was very upset. Godwin pleaded with his daughter to come home, to leave Percy and come back to his house, but she would not do so. So she does run off, and they elope. And then a major event in 1815, in the winter of 1815, Mary Shelley gives birth to a baby Clara. But of course, Clara dies within a month. It was not uncommon at that time, given that you can imagine the conditions they're living in. They're living in poverty. They don't have a whole lot of money. They're traveling from town to town, not proper medical care. It's not surprising then to understand that young baby Clara died within a month. And again, I will make the argument as we make our way through this unit that the baby Clara seems to haunt over this novel, um, as we get into the reading of Frankenstein. In March of 1815, so this is about a month after the death of Clara, Mary Shelley records a dream. She records this in her journal, by the way. In her journal, she describes a dream. In the dream, she holds the dead baby of Clara, the dead body of Clara, excuse me, in front of a fire and rubs it. And as she holds it in front of the fire and rubs its chest, the eyes open up and the baby comes back to life. And this dream, she wakes up in a cold sweat. It obviously shocks her. And it creates a great deal of internal conflict for young Mary Shelley at this point. You see, as a romantic, the romantics would rebel against the idea of man trying to play God. Remember, the romantics were people who were kind of a reaction to the Enlightenment. They were meant to be a check against the Enlightenment, this idea that we could use science to discover anything. As a romantic, she would rebel against the idea of man playing God, man giving life. But as a mother, obviously she greatly desired nothing more than to have Clara back. And so she was greatly conflicted by this dream. In fact, in her journal for March 19th, 1815, I'm quoting directly from the journal here, she says, "Dreamt that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day, not in good spirits. Um, and I would ask you to keep this in mind, this idea of the baby coming back to life or holding it before the fire, bring it back to life, as you read the text, and look for in the text images in the text that, right, especially in those opening letters, you might find some images that remind you of this dream. Obviously, it played a key role in the writing of this text. She's also living in a time, Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley are living during a time where scientists were experimenting with electricity. Um, this is shortly after Benjamin Franklin and the kite and the key and all that. This was a time where scientists were experimenting with the use of electricity, and they were doing it on drowning victims. They thought that if they could bring someone who had drowned and they could use electricity, not that much different than the devices we use today to try to reanimate people. They thought that they could use electricity to resuscitate drowning victims. And being who she was, Percy and Mary Shelley would have traveled with her husband Percy, and they would oftentimes go and visit universities, and they would visit experiments, and they would watch these experiments being done, watch how you could take a corpse, run electricity through it, and how the body starts to move. And you have to imagine being a young Mary Shelley, sitting in an audience, watching them run electricity through a dead body and seeing the body twitch and the muscles move, and the implications of that. For a young grieving mother, the implications that, is it possible that we could reanimate the dead, that we could bring them back? And even if you have just a cursory knowledge of the Frankenstein myth, you can start to understand how that's going to play a role here. In the summer of 1816, Mary Shelley, Percy, and her stepsister Claire Clairmont, who actually is now friends with her, they spend the summer in Geneva, Switzerland, with Lord Byron and his friend Dr. John Polidori. It was a cold summer. The group spent its times indoors. They're using laudanum. It's in one of the videos that you'll watch that goes with this, they talk about that there was a huge volcano eruption slightly before this summer, and the volcano eruption, I think it was down in Italy, shot all this ash up into the sky, and the ash was up, and the ash eventually makes its way over Switzerland, and the ash kind of blocks out the sun for this summer. And so the summer of 1816 is considered, if you look back in history, it's one of the coldest summers in history. This, the sun couldn't shine through, and so it was cold and rainy and dark all the time. And so here you have Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, Claire Clairmont visiting their good friend Lord Byron, another famous poet in his right. And Lord Byron brings his friend Dr. John Polidori, and they're kind of spending the summer in Geneva, Switzerland at Lord Byron's house. But because of the weather, they couldn't spend a whole lot of time outdoors. And so instead, they do a couple of things. Number one, they start taking drugs. We've made reference to laudanum. It's an opiate that would make you hallucinate. So they start taking opiates. They start taking laudanum, which is causing them to hallucinate. Of course, they're having a lot of sex. They're all sleeping with each other because they're romantics. And they also start to read these old German ghost stories. And just that in themselves, I've actually had an opportunity to read these old German ghost stories that they were reading, and they're really quite compelling. This is their summer, sitting indoors, reading these old German ghost stories, and doing drugs. And so if you're reading ghost stories and doing hallucinogens, obviously it's going to lead to a very interesting experience. So part of this summer, they decide to have a contest where they decide they want to see who can write the best scary story. So they're on drugs, stuck indoors, reading these old stories, and they start to write their own. John Polidori actually comes up with a very interesting text that I made reference to earlier in class. John Polidori writes a novel called The Vampire. It's a very interesting text historically, because up until this point, when we think about the vampire myth, vampires up until this point, vampires were tantamount to what we would describe as zombies today. They were mindless beings and myths, Celtic myths and things like that would roam the land and would suck people's blood, but they were mindless beings, like zombies are today. However, John Polidori's The Vampire was the first text that we had the aristocratic sexualized vampire, the intelligent vampire who used his sexual appeal to lure women to their doom, where he would obviously kill them. And obviously, Polidori's text met with mixed reviews, but about a generation after Polidori, a young writer came across his novel, The Vampire, and was so moved by it that he decided to write his own text, inspired on Polidori's text. And of course, the text this young man, of course, I'm talking about, is Bram Stoker. And this, of course, leads to the writing of Dracula, which I think is a more modern text today. So believe it or not, the origins of Dracula, or even our modern vampire myths today, kind of take their origin from the summer of 1816 in Geneva, Switzerland, where John Polidori writes his text. And if that wasn't interesting enough, just to think that that was the second most famous text written in that summer, because of course Mary Shelley, while high on laudanum, has what she describes as a waking dream. I think we can use the term hallucination. And in this waking dream, she sees the iconic laboratory scene, the man standing over the monster, injecting it and bringing it to life. And in this waking dream, she is inspired to come up with the concept of Victor Frankenstein and his monster. And it's over the course of the summer that she develops one of the great texts of all time, Frankenstein. So as we look at this text, talking about themes, the major theme here is going to be the destructive power of knowledge. Romantic literature was a rejection of the Enlightenment. It was meant to warn us. These type of stories are cautionary tales. They're meant to warn us about the dangers of trying to play God. They share themes with something like Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, or The World Is Too Much With Us. These are poems that offer up the kind of the same theme here. That if we are scientists and we search for knowledge, inevitably that knowledge could end up destroying us. And this becomes a prominent theme when we move into like 20th century science fiction. Think of how many science fiction novels that we know, or science fiction films that are about man using technology and that technology destroying them. I'm thinking of Isaac Asimov and something like I Am Robot. If you think of, even if you got into like the Alien movies, there's any number of texts, scientific texts, that are all kind of the same theme. Man creates knowledge or science or discovery, and is destroyed by that discovery. As I mentioned before, in this novel, light and fire are symbols for knowledge. Victor Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus as he attempts to steal fire or knowledge from the gods and circumvent the laws of man. And as we continue to go through this text, pay close attention to comparisons between Victor and Prometheus. Specifically, Mary Shelley throughout the text will make subtle references to chains. Oftentimes, Victor will metaphorically say, I felt like I was chained up. The manacles had bitten into my flesh and things like that. He oftentimes will describe it like he's feeling chained up. And it's obviously Mary Shelley uses that imagery to try to communicate to us that Victor Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus. He is the man who steals knowledge from the gods, the knowledge, the elixir of life, the knowledge of how to create life, steals it, and shocker, is punished for doing so. And finally, the idea of monstrosity and isolation. Throughout the text, the characters will find themselves isolated and alone. We will focus on both Victor Frankenstein and his monster, finding themselves isolated and alone. This otherness allows the novel to redefine the concept of monstrosity. Again, if you had read something like I Am Legend, I think I Am Legend leads very well into this, the idea of what it means to be a monster. I Am Legend, of course, provides us that incredible lesson that if you are the last man alive in a world full of monsters, they're not the monsters you are. And I think we'll see that theme play out here in Frankenstein as well. This isolation allows the reader to call into question the reliability of the narrators. And I do think that Kenneth Branagh makes a very interesting point when he talks about Hamlet and Victor Frankenstein. Hamlet and Victor Frankenstein are each obsessed with death. Hamlet's whole story is a philosophical preparation for death. Victor's is an intellectual refusal to accept it. And I think that's a good way of kind of understanding this text. And so that kind of brings me to an end of our initial discussion of this text. It is incredibly complex, but I think you need that background information to help understand it. So I really hope that you enjoy the book. It is really a compelling narrative, and I look forward to working you through it. Again, thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day.